I still remember the exact sound, the way the key twisted in the lock behind me, slow and deliberate, sealing my fate on the other side of that door. It wasn't just metal against metal, it was the echo of a decision, the confirmation that I no longer belonged inside my own home. I stood there, stunned, my hand trembling on the handle as I tried to turn it, willing it to open. But it didn't. They had locked me out. The word echoed in my mind like a hammer blow. Locked out. The night was colder than I expected. The wind whipped through the yard, pulling at my thin sweater as if it wanted to strip me bare. My breath came out in small clouds, sharp and fast, while my chest tightened with panic. I could hear faint voices on the other side of the door, muffled but unmistakable, moving on as if nothing had happened. My family, the very people I had given everything for, were sitting in warmth and light while I stood outside in the dark, cast away like a stranger. My knees buckled, and I had to steady myself against the wall, just to keep from collapsing. The concrete under my feet was unforgiving, biting into my bones through thin shoes not meant for the cold. My heart raced so fast I thought I would faint, each beat pounding in my ears louder than the silence of the street around me. I knocked once, then again, softly at first, and then harder, but no one answered. They knew I was there. They had chosen not to let me back in. The sting of rejection is unlike any physical pain. It doesn't bruise the skin, it bruises the soul. Standing there unwanted, I felt decades of sacrifice crash over me, all at once. The nights I stayed awake, caring for fevers, the meals I cooked, the bills I paid, the endless hours of work I poured into making a home, all of it reduced to nothing in the turn of a key. They didn't yell, they didn't argue, they simply shut me out, as if I no longer existed. I tried to steady my breathing, but the cold air burned my lungs. My hands shook as I pressed them together for warmth, but the trembling came not just from the night air, it came from the truth settling deep inside me. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. It was a message. They wanted me outside, silent, forgotten. I leaned my forehead against the door for a moment, listening to the faint clinking of dishes inside, the sound of laughter, the television humming. Life went on without me, as though I had already been erased. My throat tightened, but no tears came. The shock was too heavy, too sharp, leaving no room even for crying. Only silence, only the cold. And in that silence, the word repeated itself again and again. Locked out. Locked out of the house, locked out of the family, locked out of the life I had built. If this story already touched your heart from the very beginning, leave a like so more people can see it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of stories that carry truth and transformation. Because that night, as I stood outside with the cold pressing into my bones, I learned something I had never imagined I would face, that family can close its doors on you. Not just with wood and steel, but with choices that pierce deeper than knives. And now I want to ask you, have you ever felt locked out, not just from a house, but from a place where you thought you belonged? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the pain of being shut out. My name is Miriam. I am 78 years old, and once this house was mine, the place I built with love, the place I filled with warmth, the place where laughter used to bounce off the walls and the smell of fresh bread lingered long after the oven cooled. I was not just the woman of the house. I was the heart of it, the one everyone turned to when decisions had to be made, when wounds needed healing, when someone had to be strong. For years, I believed that this home was proof of all my sacrifices, all my choices, all the nights I worked myself to the bone so that my children could grow up safe, secure, and proud. And for a long time, they were. They were proud of me, proud to call me mother, proud to bring their friends home to a house that was always welcoming, always full of life. But time has a way of changing things, and sometimes it changes not just the seasons, but the way people look at you. Once I was the matriarch who carried everyone's weight on her shoulders. Now, I am the old woman they treat as if I were a shadow. I think back to when I first became a wife. My husband, Daniel, was my partner in every sense of the word. He wasn't rich, but he was rich in love, and together we built something out of almost nothing. I remember working side by side with him to pay off this house, the house that stood like a promise of stability for our family. I scrubbed floors, took extra shifts at the factory, sewed clothes late into the night, anything to keep food on the table and bills paid. And he with his calloused hands and quiet determination, did the same. Every nail in the walls, every coat of paint, every garden bed in the yard carried a piece of us. We built not just a home, but a legacy. When Daniel passed, a piece of me went with him. The house that once felt like a sanctuary suddenly echoed with absence. I thought that maybe my children would close the gap, that their love would soften the silence he left behind. At first, they did. They visited often, they checked on me, they assured me that I was not alone. But as months turned into years, the warmth faded. Visits became shorter, calls less frequent, and when they did come, their eyes scanned the rooms, not with nostalgia, but with calculation. I started to notice it, their whispers, when they thought I was out of earshot. Their conversations about practicality, about costs, about how keeping me in the house was too much. It was as if the home I built, the life I had sacrificed for, had somehow shifted ownership. In their minds, no longer did they see me as the pillar of this family. They saw me as an obstacle, a problem to be solved. And the more they talked, the more I felt the walls closing in. I had always been the one to hold everything together. When Daniel was alive, he used to say, "Miriam, you are the fire that keeps us all warm." But what happens when the fire is no longer wanted? When the warmth you've given becomes an inconvenience? That's what I began to learn in those years after he was gone. The contrast still shocks me. I remember Christmas dinners where the table groaned under the weight of food, and there was laughter so loud that neighbors could hear. I remember birthdays where the house was filled with balloons and cake crumbs and children, running through the hallways with sticky fingers and loud giggles. This place was once alive with joy. Now, the same walls hear cold voices calculating what's practical and efficient. The same hallways echo with footsteps that avoid my room. The same kitchen, where I once fed every hungry mouth, now feels like enemy territory, where I am reminded of my burden. And in that shift, I felt my own place in this family vanish. Once the respected matriarch, I became the silent occupant. Once the decision maker, I became the one decisions were made about. Once the woman who sustained everyone else, I became the weight they claimed they could no longer carry. There is a kind of pain that goes deeper than loneliness. It is the pain of being erased while still alive, of being seen not as a person but as a problem. And it is that pain I began to carry every day, until the night they showed me the final truth with the sound of a key turning in the lock. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And I want to know if these words are reaching someone who understands what it feels like to go from being the heart of a family to being treated as if you no longer matter. It started with whispers, the kind you almost miss if you are not paying attention. But I was paying attention. When you grow old, people think your hearing fades, but what truly sharpens with age is your instinct. You learn to read the silence between words, to notice the way a glance is exchanged, the way a sentence drops into the air and stops suddenly when you enter the room. That's how I began to understand. My son and his wife weren't just having casual conversations. They were planning, calculating, deciding, and every word carried the unspoken message. I was no longer part of the family's decisions. I was the subject of them. I remember one morning, I came into the kitchen to make tea. They were at the table, paper spread out in front of them. I caught only fragments. Costs are too high. It doesn't make sense. Space we could use differently. When they noticed me, the papers disappeared quickly into a drawer, and their voices grew sweet, almost rehearsed. "Good morning, Mom," my son said, with a smile too stiff to be real. His wife chimed in, "Do you want some breakfast?" But the air was already poisoned with what they hadn't said. They weren't talking about bills or groceries. They were talking about me, about the costs of keeping me in the home I had built. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Families talk about money, about space, about the future. But then it happened again and again. At night, when they thought I was asleep, I would hear their voices drifting down the hallway. "She's too much responsibility," his wife would say. "We can't keep living like this. We need to think about ourselves." And my son, my own flesh and blood, would not disagree. His silence cut me more than her words, because silence meant consent. I noticed the way they began to act during the day, too. Decisions that once would have included me now happened without my knowledge. One afternoon, I found strangers walking through the backyard with clipboards, pointing at the fence, the garden, the very walls Daniel and I had built with our own hands. "Who are these people?" I asked. stepping outside. My daughter-in-law answered quickly. Just some appraisers, nothing to worry about. She brushed past me as if I were a nosy neighbor, not the woman who owned the ground they were standing on. It wasn't just the secrecy. It was the look in their eyes. I used to see love, trust, respect. Now I saw irritation, calculation, a thin veil of politeness that cracked the moment they thought I wasn't looking. My son avoided conversations with me altogether. If I asked about bills, he said, "Don't worry about it." If I asked about the strange letters arriving in the mail, he said, "It's nothing you need to think about." Piece by piece, they stripped me of involvement, of agency, of voice, and the net result. I began to feel like a ghost in my own house. They moved around me like I was furniture. They discussed my future as if I weren't. Sitting 2 rooms away, they whispered about costs and space, about how things would be better when ... as though I were a temporary inconvenience instead of their mother. The worst part was the silence of the younger ones. My grandchildren saw it. I could tell by the way their eyes darted, by the way they quickly changed the subject when I walked into a room. They weren't cruel, not like their parents, but they weren't brave either. Their silence was another form of betrayal. To watch someone suffer and say nothing is to agree with the cruelty. I wanted to shake them, to scream, "Do you not see me? Do you not remember who I was, who I am?" But the words stayed locked in my chest, and the silence grew louder. Every whisper, every hidden plan, every secret meeting at that kitchen table pushed me further out of the home I had once commanded. The matriarch, the provider, the woman who held it all together, was now treated like an obstacle, a problem to be solved quietly. I had become the cost they didn't want to carry, the space they wanted to reclaim, the burden they wanted to put away. Do you think silence can wound deeper than cruel words? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes it's not the shouting that breaks us, it's the quiet decision to treat us as if we are already gone. It happened on an afternoon that began like any other, the kind of day where nothing seems remarkable, and yet by nightfall, your entire sense of self has been rearranged. I was in the living room, folding laundry the way I had done for decades, shirts into neat stacks, towels folded with corners perfectly aligned, socks paired together, all with the care of someone who believes that even the smallest tasks matter when done with love. My son walked in with a few relatives who had come to visit. There was laughter, casual chatter, the kind of light conversation that families often share. I thought maybe this would be one of those rare days where things felt normal again. But then it happened. My daughter-in-law made a remark about how crowded the house felt, and before I could even process it, my son responded with words that landed like a blade straight to my chest. "It's because of her," he said, pointing in my direction, his tone casual, almost dismissive, as though he were stating a simple fact about the weather. "She just sits here, doing nothing. She's useless now, just taking up space." The words froze me in place. Useless. Coming from my own child, the boy I had carried for 9 months, the boy I had fed when I barely had enough to eat myself, the boy whose fever I had nursed through endless nights, the boy I had clothed, guided, and protected. To hear him call me useless, not in anger, not in private, but in front of others, was like being erased while still breathing. There was silence for a second, the kind of silence that usually follows something shocking, but then it was broken, not by defense, not by anyone standing up for me, but by laughter. My daughter-in-law laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that sliced through the room. One of my granddaughters giggled too, hiding her face behind her phone, but not enough to hide the cruelty of her smirk. In that moment, I wasn't a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had given her life to this family. I was a joke. My face burned hot, though the rest of my body felt like ice. My hands trembled so badly I dropped a towel onto the floor, but no one bent to help me. No one noticed. Or perhaps they noticed, and chose to look away. That was the moment I felt it most strongly, the disappearance of my identity. I wasn't Miriam, the woman who had built this house with her own hands, who had kept the family together when storms came. I was nothing more than an inconvenience, a punchline, to be tossed around in casual conversation. I wanted to scream, to remind them of who I had been, to shout about the sacrifices, the nights without sleep, the meals skipped so they could eat, the countless ways I had put their needs above my own. But my throat closed up, my voice stuck somewhere between rage and despair. And as they continued their conversation, as though my humiliation had never even happened, I realized that they had already decided who I was. In their eyes, I was no longer worth defending. The hardest part was not the insult itself. It was the ripple effect of what followed. For the rest of the day, every glance in my direction carried the weight of dismissal. Every silence at the table felt like agreement. They didn't need to repeat the word useless. It was already written into the air, carved into my skin, echoing in every laugh that followed. I carried that word with me into the evening. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed it over and over, wondering how a lifetime of love could be erased by a single word. How someone I gave everything to could reduce me to nothing in the presence of others. And that is what humiliation does. It doesn't just sting in the moment. It lingers. It festers. It makes you question your worth. For days afterward, I found myself moving quieter, shrinking into the background, as if trying to take up less space in a house that was no longer mine. But deep down, a small fire burned, because I knew the truth. I knew that I was not useless, that no human being who has given love, care, and sacrifice can ever be useless. Their laughter was not proof of my worthlessness, it was proof of their blindness. Still, in that moment, I felt erased, silenced, humiliated beyond words. If you believe no one deserves to be humiliated by their own family, subscribe now for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been made to feel small by the very people who should have lifted you up? Sometimes the worst pain comes not from enemies, but from those we once trusted to protect us. After the day of my public humiliation, I thought the silence in the house would crush me completely. I moved around like a shadow, careful not to make noise, careful not to take up space, careful not to remind them that I still existed. My meals became smaller, my footsteps lighter, and my words fewer. I thought no one noticed the way I withdrew, but someone did. It wasn't my son. It wasn't my daughter-in-law. It wasn't even my older grandchildren, who kept their eyes glued to their phones or to the floor when the tension in the air grew heavy. It was the youngest, the one I thought was too quiet, too timid to ever speak. Up one evening, when I had skipped dinner because I couldn't bear to sit at the table where laughter excluded me, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. I didn't answer at first. I was tired of knocks that brought nothing but requests or orders. But then I heard a small voice, "Grandma, it's me." When I opened the door, there he stood, Daniel, my youngest grandson, holding a plate covered with foil. "I saved you some food," he whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. "Don't tell Mom and Dad." He slipped into the room quickly, set the plate on my nightstand, and smiled in that shy way only children can. I stared at the plate as though it were gold, not because of the food itself, a bit of chicken, some rice, a slice of bread, but because of what it meant. Someone had noticed, someone had cared. In that moment, I felt seen, not as a burden, not as useless, but as a person who mattered enough for someone to sneak through shadows to bring comfort. It didn't stop there. The next day, after another tense dinner, where I remained silent, Daniel knocked again. This time, he brought cookies wrapped in a napkin. "I know you like sweets," he said, his eyes glowing with mischief. I couldn't help but smile. It was the first real smile that had crossed my face in weeks, and he noticed. "See," he said proudly, "you still have the best smile." From then on, it became a quiet ritual. Every evening, when the house settled and no one was watching, he would come to me with something small, a piece of fruit, a blanket when the night grew cold, or sometimes nothing at all but his presence. He would sit at the edge of my bed or on the old chair in my room and simply ask, "Are you okay, Grandma?" It was such a simple question, yet it carried more healing power than any of the empty words his parents threw my way. I began to tell him stories about his grandfather, about how we built this house, about the struggles and the victories, about the family he came from. He listened with wide eyes, absorbing every detail, as if my words were treasures. He didn't mock me. He didn't interrupt. He listened, and in that listening, he restored a piece of my dignity that had been stripped away. For the first time in so long, I felt a spark of life inside me. The humiliation had nearly extinguished my fire, but Daniel's small acts of kindness rekindled it. Every time he slipped through my door, with food, or a joke, or simply a pair of ears willing to hear me, I felt stronger. I felt less erased. I felt that maybe, just maybe, I still had a voice. One night, he surprised me even more. He came into the room with a small notebook. "I want to write down your stories," he said, "so they don't disappear." My throat tightened as I watched him scribble down the names of people he had never met, the recipes his grandfather and I used to cook, the lessons I had learned in a lifetime of sacrifice. My stories mattered to him. My life mattered to him. And through his pen, through his attention, I began to believe again that my existence was not worthless. Daniel became my secret ally in a house that had turned hostile. His presence reminded me that even when most of the world tries to silence you, all it takes is one voice, one person willing to listen, to bring your worth back into the light. Have you ever been defended by someone when you least expected it? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the greatest courage doesn't come from the people we rely on most, it comes from the ones we least imagined would fight for us. It happened on an evening I will never forget. The tension in the house had been building like a storm, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. My son and his wife were at the table, papers spread before them, speaking in the clipped, cold tones I had grown used to. They spoke as though I didn't exist, as though I were a shadow lingering in the room, not a woman who had lived a life, built a home, and raised a family. I sat silently in the corner, knitting in my lap but my hands too stiff to move. And then, Daniel walked in. He was younger than the others, just 16, but in that moment, he carried himself with a strength I had not seen in anyone for years. His voice broke the air like a blade. "You can't treat her like this." His words were not loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the room instantly. My son looked up in surprise. My daughter-in-law narrowed her eyes, but Daniel did not falter. "She has a voice," he said, pointing at me, "and it matters." I felt my breath catch. Those words, simple, clear, defiant, were the words I had been dying to hear. For years, my own voice had been swallowed by silence, dismissed, ignored, but here, through my grandson, it returned with a force I could not have summoned alone. My son tried to wave him off. "Daniel, you don't understand. This is about responsibility, about money, about what's practical." But Daniel cut him off. "No, it's not. This is about respect. This is about love. You talk about her like she's not even here, like she doesn't matter, but she does. She matters more than you realize." His mother snapped, "Watch your tone." But Daniel stood taller, his fists clenched at his sides. "I will not be quiet about this. I've heard the things you say when you think she's not listening. I've seen the way you treat her, and I won't let it continue." The room shifted. The air grew heavy, every eye locked on him. My son looked furious, his pride wounded, but Daniel did not stop. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Do you want proof?" he asked. His voice shook slightly, but his eyes burned with fire. "Because I have it." He played a recording, one he had made on a night I thought I was alone in hearing their whispers. The audio filled the room. His mother's voice mocking me, his father talking about selling the house, words of dismissal and cruelty I had tried so hard to swallow. Hearing them echo in the open, undeniable, made my chest tighten. But then came the silence, a silence that, for the first time, wasn't mine to carry. Daniel looked at them with a steadiness far beyond his years. "You can't deny it anymore. You can't pretend she's imagining things. You said these words. You laughed at her. You humiliated her. And I won't let you erase her. She is not useless. She is not a burden. She is our family. She is my grandmother. And if you can't treat her with the respect she deserves, then you'll have to answer to me." My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from something I had almost forgotten. Pride. Pride that my voice was not gone. Pride that my worth had not been erased. Pride that through my grandson, my truth was finally being spoken out loud. My son's face flushed red. My daughter-in-law muttered something under her breath, but the room was no longer theirs. For once, it belonged to me again through Daniel. His courage lit a fire that warmed every part of me that had grown cold. For the first time in years, I felt seen, defended, alive. I looked at him and whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady, "Thank you." He turned to me and smiled, and in his eyes I saw something I thought had been lost forever: justice, raw and unshakable. If this moment of justice made your heart beat faster, click like so this story can reach even more people. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone speak the truth when everyone else stayed silent? Sometimes, it only takes one brave voice to change everything. That night, after Daniel's words had cut through the silence of years, I sat in my room longer than usual. The echoes of his voice replayed in my head, firm, unyielding, louder than the whispers of betrayal I had endured. For the first time in so long, I did not feel like a shadow in my own house. I felt present. I felt real. I felt heard. And it wasn't because I had shouted or fought. It was because one person, one young soul, who should have been too young to carry such weight, had decided I was worth defending. The shift inside me was undeniable. I realized I no longer needed to wait for respect from those who had already decided to strip me of it. I no longer needed to beg for love where none remained. My worth wasn't theirs to measure. It never had been. And so, I began to think not about what they had taken from me, but about what I still had to be and to whom it should belong. The house I had built with my husband's hands and my sacrifices had always felt like more than walls and bricks. It was the story of my life. Every room carried laughter, struggle, loss, and resilience. Every window had seen both storms and sun. For years, I believed this house would pass to my son, the natural order of things. But nature had been broken. Love had been replaced with calculation. Warmth had been replaced with cruelty. And in that break, I understood something that gave me peace. This house, these memories, this legacy, did not belong to the ones who had locked me out. It belonged to the one who had let me back in, not through a door, but through his heart. Quietly, in the weeks that followed, I visited the notary office. I walked in with documents and determination, carrying myself taller than I had in years. I asked for everything, every paper, every signature, every detail to be arranged so that Daniel would inherit what truly mattered. The lawyer looked at me with gentle eyes and asked, "Are you sure?" And my answer came with a steadiness I hadn't known I still possessed. Yes, more than ever. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't spite. It was clarity, a reflection of truth. Love is not about blood alone. Love is about presence, about courage, about who chooses to stand with you when the world tries to erase you. Daniel chose me, and so I chose him. When I returned home, I carried no papers in my hands, no announcement to make. My decision was silent, hidden, like a seed planted beneath the soil. But inside me, the weight of years lifted. I could finally breathe in my own dignity again. For once, I wasn't moving quietly out of fear, I was moving quietly out of strength. At night, when the house was still, I sat by the window and watched the moon cast silver light over the yard. I thought of my husband, of the promises we once made, of the family we tried to build. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilt that it had all unraveled. I felt gratitude that, even in the ashes, something pure remained. Daniel would come to me with his notebook, writing down my stories, his eyes glowing as if each word I gave him was a treasure. And I realized they were treasures. My life, my voice, my truth, they were worth something. They were worth everything. And so I made my choice, not loudly, not with confrontation, but with resolve. Everything I had, this house, my belongings, the legacy of my life, would go to him. Not because he asked for it, not because he expected it, but because he saw me. He defended me. He reminded me that even when the world tries to shut the door, justice finds its way back in. And you, in my place, would you forgive those who locked you out, or would you give everything to the one who stood by your side? Tell me in the comments, because the choices we make in silence often reveal the loudest truths of who we are. If stories like this make you reflect on family and justice, subscribe now so you won't miss the next one. They locked me out, but justice found me. There is a kind of strength that does not roar, a strength that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. It is the strength that comes from surviving the silence, from walking through cold nights when every door seems closed, and still standing tall the next morning. That was the strength I discovered when I was locked out, when the very people who should have kept me safe chose instead to treat me like a burden. At first, I thought that moment would break me completely. But what I learned is that sometimes the breaking is what allows the light to enter. Being excluded, humiliated, erased, it could have destroyed me. But in that emptiness, God planted something greater. A reminder that human rejection can never erase divine purpose. When they locked the door, they thought they were shutting me away from life. But what they did not realize is that life cannot be locked away. Dignity cannot be sealed behind wood and metal. Truth always finds its way out, and justice always finds its way in. I began to see my journey differently. For so long, I begged to be seen, to be valued, to be remembered by the very people who had already decided to forget me. But when Daniel stood up, When his voice carried mine back into the room, I realized that I had never truly been invisible. My worth was still alive. My story was still burning. And sometimes, all it takes is one spark, a single soul brave enough to say, "She matters," to ignite a fire that no cruelty can extinguish. That fire reminded me that my life is not measured by the ones who failed me, but by the ones who stood by me. It reminded me that even in betrayal, love can still be found. It may not come from the expected places, it may not come from the child you raised or the family you sacrificed for, but love finds its way. And when it does, it restores everything that was broken. Faith taught me that no rejection is final. People may lock you out, but God has doors no man can close. They may silence your voice, but truth echoes, louder than fear. They may strip you of titles, possessions, or recognition, but they cannot touch the soul of someone who knows their value in the eyes of God. I was not abandoned, I was being redirected. I was not harassed, I was being rewritten into a story of resilience. When I look back now, I no longer see only pain, I see purpose. I see a testimony that someone else out there needs to hear. Because maybe you, too, have been locked out not just from a house, but from love, from respect, from the place where you thought you belonged. And maybe you believe you have nothing left to give. But hear me, as long as you are alive, your story matters, your truth has power, and justice, in ways you cannot yet see, is already on its way. This conclusion is not about bitterness, nor about revenge. It is about freedom. Freedom to choose where my love will go, who will inherit my legacy, and how I will be remembered. I choose to leave my story not in the hands of those who tried to silence me, but in the hands of the one who lifted me up when I could no longer lift myself. That choice gave me peace. That choice gave me back my dignity. And maybe the real victory was never about keeping the house, or the possessions, or the status. Maybe the real victory was about proving that no one, not even family, has the power to erase who you are when you decide to stand in the truth. I am Miriam. I was locked out, but I was never lost. And my story, like every story rooted in love and justice, will outlive the walls they tried to keep me behind. If this story touched your heart, leave a like now and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter. Because in our next video, we will uncover what happens when a daughter takes everything from her mother only to face a twist that even she never saw coming. You won't want to miss it.